The hybrid club was at the peak of its operations for the night. The music was on the verge of eardrum bursting. The populace of the bar divided it into mainly two groups. The depressed patrons, who were beginning to slur their orders, and the younger, more energetic population, who'd come in for a night of fun and were already at the brink of going batshit as a result of too much finger food and equally as much alcohol buzzing through their veins. Seth was part of the former. His head pounded along with the rhythm of the trashy music that had already repeated 4 times or more, and the people around him were beginning to seem blurry, more like triplicates of themselves. Needless to say, Seth was wasted. Normally, he wouldn't have minded his inebriation. Bars and clubs had been his nightly residence since the tragic death of his wife, as intoxication was his preferred way of dealing with shit. However, the sudden visit of her parents to his apartment, coupled with the news of their intention to file for the custody of their love child, was something that cracked Seth up to bitch level. He couldn't stand the music, and every oblivious flirt that came from the lady beside him had him on the brink of madness. Every lustful stare that came his way from any female that came to get a drink or nibble at the finger food increasingly got under his skin, and the fact that the blinding strobes from the overhead lights and his lightheadedness was preventing him from getting up didn't make matters any better. When the couple to his right began to wrestle with their tongues and swap all manner of bacteria via their saliva, Seth finally decided that he had enough bullshit for one night. He beckoned a waiter over and slapped down enough bills that should cover his tab for the evening. Seth couldn't remember for sure if he had been able to get up from the bar stool and onto his feet, or if he had just collapsed right off from the attempt. But the last thing he remembered that night was the room whirling out of focus at a severe rotation and ending with a loud bang. When Seth came back to consciousness, he had fully expected to find himself face down in a puddle of his own vomit with a powerful headache, his throat feeling like it had been filled by the contents of half the Sahara, or hell, even partial blindness or memory loss. Considering how he'd almost emptied a nation's reserve of alcohol the night before, Seth knew how he should have been feeling. But in reality, his actual condition was not up to the tith of the actual punishment that usually awaited him in hangover. He felt nothing of the aforementioned symptoms. A feeling of dread had taken the stead of his envisaged torment, and the initial mustard seed-sized feeling began to grow when he became aware of his surroundings and realized that the warm, sparsely illuminated room he was in was familiarly unfamiliar. His apprehension increased when his eyes began to adapt to the darkness, and he saw that he wasn't alone. Then multiplied when he came to understand what he must have been doing with the woman next to him. His anxiety shot through the roof when he figured who he shared the room with. Miranda was sleeping closely next to him in bed, her face glowing in some sort of post-orgasmic ecstasy, as though she hadn't been the origin of his marital problems, as though she wasn't the reason why his wife had died the way she did, as though he hadn't put the bullet that ended her life through her skull 4 months ago. Seth wasn't sure he was seeing right, but he was also certain that hallucinations were not a symptom of being hungover, no matter how many gallons of alcohol he guzzled down. He brought his hand up to Miranda's nostrils to see that she was still breathing. The feeling of warm breath sent goosebumps up his arms and through his entire body in quick succession. The goosebumps weren't of the good kind. Neither was the gasp that escaped Seth's lips, when a vice-like grip suddenly clasped around his wrist just as he was about to withdraw his hand. With her eyelids still shut, Miranda's smile made dread clog Seth's throat with the taste of bile. It was nothing like the mischievous and challenging smile that Seth was used to. This one seemed like the murderous smile of a predator playing with its afternoon meal, prepping it up, spicing it with fear to be eaten in a leisurely fashion. Unfortunately, Seth found his hunch to be true when Miranda's eyes opened sharply, not bothering with the hesitant feminine fluttering of eyelashes to reveal devilish yellow pupils instead of her normal brown, filled by darkest black surrounding the iris. Seth's heart began to climb up his throat when the serpent-like woman flashed her nude detention to reveal a full set of ugly, yellowed fangs. "Welcome back home, mon amour," Miranda cooed as she brought his wrist, which was still in her grasp, closer to her mouth. Seth was at a loss for what to do. For some reason, his stallion's strength was useless against this woman. Each second that passed seemed to reveal more of Miranda's beastly nature, and less of the woman he'd seen when he first woke up in his very own bed that for some reason felt like a stranger's. "I'm glad you finally got rid of your mortal wife. Now we can be together forever," she went on as she sank her fangs into Seth's skin and began to lick off the blood that flowed out of the fresh wound. Seth had never felt so disgusted, terrified, and confused as he had at that moment. It had to be a very realistic nightmare, didn't it? He didn't realize he'd been screaming until he heard another scream. A louder scream that sounded too much like his daughter's. He opened his eyes to find himself in the middle of his living room and was holding a knife to his 9-year-old daughter.
Subscribe today or beware.